Hello and welcome to UK Column. Today I'm joined by Matthew Ehret. Some time ago we spoke about the issue of UFOs and UFOs being a psychological operation. And in fact, we spoke about it because you had started investigating this. And by coincidence, I can't even remember what it was that was in the media at the time that I mentioned to you. But you have produced two documentaries so far on this issue. And I've just watched episode 2, which you sent it to me and said this will blow your mind, and indeed it did. So let's start off, if we could, with a little bit of introduction about your background and why you decided to cover this particular topic.
Oh, well, Mike, yeah, thank you for having me on. And yeah, I'm very passionate about this. So I'm very happy to be with you to chat a little bit more about the process and why we're doing this. It's not a solo act. My wife has really pulled this together. And about a year and a half ago, almost by happenstance, 2 years ago, during the trucker convoy, we had the good fortune of making the acquaintance of a podcaster named Jason Dahl. Who happened to be an incredibly talented filmmaker as well. And due to COVID, it wiped out his business. He was working in a kitchen, but he was still maintaining a little podcast called Super Spreaders. And he asked me to be on as a guest. And I gotta share you this quick story how we discovered that he has this talent, because he sends me about a week before I'm about to be on as his guest a promo video that he made about 10 minutes long. And he said, "Here, you can use this to promote our upcoming chat." It's one of the highest quality promo videos, like nearly documentary level promo videos that he made off the cuff, and then he made another one, and then he made another one for a small podcast that would have maybe a few hundred people watching it. And I was like, wait a minute, there's too much talent here. We have to do something with this. So we began to see what was possible by giving him little scripts, little articles that we had written that we were curious to see if this could be rendered into multimedia. And sure enough, everything we sent over the ensuing months turned out beautiful. So we've just been pushing the limits to see how far this multimedia capability can go. And so far we haven't found a limit. And now my wife and I, we've written, or my wife has spearheaded Cynthia Chung. She's a fantastic writer, and she's written a series of films on why there are no limits to growth. We've done 2 episodes of that series. There's going to be about 9 or 10 total. Then we've done a parallel series of videos for my Canadian Patriot review. And that's going to be about 8 videos on the hidden hand behind UFOs. So we've now done 2 of those episodes. You've seen the second one that we just released this week. I myself have always been, well, not always been, but early on in my being broken out of normie land. I'll speak subjectively here. Back in, I think it was around 2004. It didn't take me long after going through 9/11 as an inside job and starting to have a lot of my major narratives break down that I encountered. And everybody does this, everybody encounters this. It's there to be found. The role of secret societies, esoterica, that has been sort of weaved through our entire history. It's not, again, you can't avoid it if you're looking at history from a conspiratorial angle, which is the only healthy way to do it. But then there's a lot of misinformation field. And for a bit of that time, for about a year, I became obsessed with aliens. And I was starting to think for between 2005, 2006, that maybe this oligarchy that's been managing humanity conspiratorially, maybe they do have special powers. Maybe there are special secrets known only to the inner elites. And maybe it has something to do with governments interfacing with aliens, which if it does occur at all, and I was beginning to believe that it did, then that would mean that it's likely that it's always been the case. Maybe there's always been aliens going back to ancient civilization, making the pyramids and communicating with the elites. So it's all a big, what's the point fighting an oligarchy that has superhuman powers given to them and technologies by an alien breed, that's out to enslave us or something. And, hey, I encountered some David Icke readings along the way that put some fuel into that fire. And then I decided I was going a bit crazy. The level of things that I was believing in that I couldn't prove to be true and that were full of misinformation was too much. So I had to put some brakes on that. And for about 11 or 12 years. I was a volunteer. I stumbled around that time on the Schiller Institute, and I began to volunteer with them in a Montreal office that existed. So that gave me a chance to become more self-aware, didn't know, and more disciplined in researching history and science from what I found to be a much more reliable method of research, which allowed me to then appreciate things I couldn't appreciate before I began that exploration regarding the role of British intelligence in the Roundtable movement, the Fabian Society, in taking over control of the United States as well as many European countries. So all of these things gave me a better backbone, I guess, more muscles to then revisit now in the last couple of years, since UFO disclosure is going mainstream. We're seeing it in CNN. They're having congressional inquiries in Mexico and Washington. The UK Department of Defense is releasing, not too secretively, but it's intended to be very public, this sort of messaging that aliens are with us. They've been interfacing with us. And so because it became obvious that this is a big part of a major psyop, which I think has a certain ritualistic initiation process behind it to bring people into a belief in a new pagan pantheon of deities. Of course, they're going to have a more ET UFO vibe in this current situation, managed by a technocratic priesthood. I figured I have to revisit some of the things I was thinking about 20 years ago and do it with a little bit more scrutiny than I was back in 2004. So my wife and I have been just doing that and reconstructing as much as we could what is really behind the whole UFO phenomenon and mythos, and what is the role of people like H.G. Wells or the Fabians or Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton comes in playing a big role, and other occultists for some reason.
And indeed, this was why we started talking about this, because I had been making the point to you just how the British press was so infused in recent weeks and months with UFO stories and really pushing this narrative that they're out there. Again, today, the Daily Mail is full of it. It's every day, almost, there's another story along these lines. Now, of course, we're all familiar with terms like Project Bluebeam, but what a lot of people don't appreciate is that a lot of this narrative did come from Britain, and we need to go back to the beginning of the 20th century to really get the beginnings of the modern narrative on this.
Yeah, and that's sort of what episode 2, actually the end of episode 1, we began to leave people with that sense that we need to go back to specifically the Theosophists, the Fabians, and the British Society for Psychical Research as some extremely important conduits. As far as there were certain battles that were taking place within the British High Command at the end of the 19th century over what to do in the face of a world of growing sovereign nation states that are beginning to break free of the shackles of the British East India Company, the City of London. They were beginning to utilize national banking, protectionism. We saw Lincoln do this, and a lot of his followers, many of whom died. Garfield, McKinley, to varying degrees, were tapping into this. Russian leaders admiring Lincoln were bringing the success of the industrial projects of America into Russia. We saw the same thing with Bismarck. We saw it also in Asia. They had a 100 Days reform movement in China that was unfortunately taken down, working with Sergei Witte to build rail between China and Russia. So there was this idea of a world of cooperating nation states that was being fought towards. We were moving closer to that era where we overcome the system of empire and exploitation through finance, or the cover of finance, but to promote feudalism. So that idea of feudalism under a financial sort of veneer was being finally overthrown. There was a crisis within the higher echelons of structures within the empire. We saw much of this encircle the decision to create a new breed of think tanks. Some of them came online as the Fabian Society under the leadership of a bunch of misanthropic eugenicists that would utilize a certain socialistic or a certain socialism to attract the poor, the working class, but really not because they cared about the poor working class, but rather just that they wanted to exploit and use them as weapons to to overthrow governments you don't like, and then to accept or demand their own enslavement under some form of a world government. The Roundtable movement was another one. The Theosophists were brought on around the similar time, under Madame Blavatsky and her, Alcott, a bunch of these mediums and spiritualists trying to create a new type of global religion based on the most superstitious, mystical elements of every religion of the world. Mediums were circulating quite a bit, being promoted. Channelers of unseen worlds were being promoted by things like the British Bureau for Psychical Research. Henry James in America was setting up a branch. We had a lot of these things, and many of them overlapped with the Rosicrucians, which were all over the British Royal Society as well, the Invisible College, as they called it. So all that to say, there was an idea, I think, of reorganizing the British Empire, focusing on the battle of the mind more than the battle of the bodies of the world. And part of that involved the role of H.G. Wells, who comes up very prominently in the second episode, who was a student of Thomas H. Huxley. Part of H.G. Wells had a variety of mandates, but one of those things is, as a very creative misanthropic person, it was discovered that he has a penchant for science fiction. A lot of those works that he was writing, like The War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man, a lot of them were influenced by the writings of Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton, a major figure within the occult underground of the aristocracy of Britain, who wrote things like describing things like Vril, that the Nazis were later on to be inspired by for their Vril society. This etheric medium that only the elite Aryans can tap into mentally, that allows them clairvoyance and telepathic powers. And the Nazis, the SS, the Thule Society, the Black Sun Order, were obsessed with this Vril stuff that allowed them to control their robots, their automata. In the case of Bulwer Lytton's story, but a big chunk of this under Wells and his retooling of it became uniting the world around threats from other planets, especially Mars. He was doing, part of his mandate was under Huxley to write for Nature magazine, which was an ex-club magazine to promote Darwinism in opposition to other, what I would say, more competent theories of evolution that were not simply Darwinian in their baseline. There were other much healthier approaches to explaining the changing fossil records and evolution as something tied to intelligent design, harmony, purpose, directionality that was all banned by Darwin. So part of the promotion of the British Empire was to justify it scientifically, saying, look, the law of the strongest over the weakest is part of nature, so you can't refute that a rule by empire is needed by nature says so. That was part of the reason why they needed Darwin to be so popular. And so Huxley, and then later on H.G. Wells, a student, were promoting working on the mind of people and shaping through predictive programming, sending messages that would leak in underneath the sentinels of logic, utilizing the cover of fiction works. A lot of the stories that projected aliens as they're known today and as they were designed by H.G. Wells as effectively a future human. What if you extend logically evolutionary forces into the future, according to people like H.G. Wells, you would get these creatures that have these big brains and little mouths, big eyes, big hands, frail bodies because they don't have to do work anymore. And that would become something that would be used to organize us around a world government.
You've named a few names there. Blavatsky, H.G. Wells, Huxley. And Huxley, we're talking about Aldous Huxley, but also Julian Huxley. And all those names are associated with the United Nations to some degree. So we've got this cabal that's pushing world government, which are directly, in many ways, involved in helping build the League of Nations and then the United Nations. But as well as that, the other thing you've mentioned there is Darwinism. And what we're looking at there, it seems to me, is a form of sort of scientific dictatorship, which we then see in the modern day as the way that the climate science is handled, or the way that that public health science is handled. And then another name that springs to mind, and I don't know if there's any connection here, is Bertrand Russell, of course, because he was proposing, the idea of the scientific dictatorship as he described it.
As you know from the documentary, we link up directly the creation of cybernetics as a science of control that grew especially under the Manhattan Project, and the unspoken major players behind the creation also of the Manhattan Project itself and the outgrowth of cybernetics, which became the sort of post-World War II system of managerial controls under sort of scientific principles. Under the Rand Corporation, we saw this also brought into NATO, into the OECD, into pretty much every governing institution of the transatlantic after World War II, was the growth of one of the students of Bertrand Russell named Norbert Wiener, who was an information theorist, an information scientist working on radar. Norbert Wiener studied as a young prodigy in Cambridge under Bertrand Russell in 1913. It was made very clear that this science of cybernetics, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Josiah Macy Foundation, which were also sponsoring eugenics, keep in mind, which is not different in a very serious way. They were very clear that this was the practical application of what Bertrand Russell had laid out in his 3-volume Principia Mathematica or Principia Scientifica. No, Mathematica. I mixed them up. Which he co-published with Alfred North Whitehead between 1910 and 1913, outlining a rebrand, a method of looking at the universe that presumed that the entire universe was a closed system that everything ponderable within the universe, was the thesis of Wells and Whitehead, could be reduced to a limited array of axioms and postulates. And that these limited axioms and postulates, once you had them memorized, you could explain away everything that is, ever was, and ever will be. And you would essentially be like Laplace's demon. You'd have the power of God. If you just had the data to plug into what effectively was a computer model, you could then extrapolate the earliest time of the Big Bang that they postulated existed without even a lot of evidence that was the case, and the heat death, the ultimate heat death of the universe, which they believed to be the natural consequence governing teleologically all life and what appears to be order and change in their cosmology of this oligarchist network that Wells and Bertrand Russell were devoted to. Wells himself, like Whitehead, were both Cambridge apostles, which is very high level. I mean, this is extremely. I mean, to be a Cambridge apostle, you are in the inner sanctum. They all postulated effectively a universe governed by the principle of death and decay. It's a closed universe. There's only a limited amount of energy to go around to keep the parts moving. And because of that, every time you have more growth anywhere in the universe, that's more energy to go around, and thus more heat death, more AKA entropy. So that was a big part of the foundation of cybernetics. That also became the bedrock of transhumanism. So Julian Huxley, who coined the term transhumanism, was utilizing a cybernetics information theory ideology or language. But back to your original question, and this is also a cover for eugenics, 21st century eugenics. It's not too many steps between the modification of Darwin to social Darwinism and its a so-called opposing school of eugenics, which are two fake oppositions. They both lead you to the same place, into effectively transhumanism. Not that later, through the gateway of cybernetics as the control mechanism. Now, this is what also H.G. Wells is calling for in his World Brain, a 1940 book he wrote that was sort of an organizing manual, as well as an earlier book, The Open Conspiracy, a blueprint for world revolution. He outlines this quite clearly, the need for the science of controls under a managerial elite. Both Wells and Russell at different times are Fabians, but the Fabians is just a conduit. It's a think tank. Not everybody who's a Fabian is necessarily in on the joke either. Russell is a part of the same network that Lord Milner is participating in through the Coefficients Club, which was a dining club of a bunch of these managers of the Roundtable movement, the Fabians. Beatrice Webb had overseen its creation, and Wells was a frequent participant. Lord Balfour who was also a leading member of the Bureau for Psychical Research, was a frequent guest. Mackinder participated. So these different think tanks appeared to be different things. One catered a little bit more to a conservative sort of the Roundtable movement and its associated Rhodes Scholarship program under the Rhodes Trust. Appealed to a little bit more of a conservative imperial personality type, whereas the Fabians appealed a little bit more to a left-leaning personality type. But they were always interfacing with each other, and their leading figures managing both were always closely communicating with each other. Yeah, there's so much that could be said about this, but no, Bertrand Russell plays a very important role and always interfacing with H.G. Wells, whether it's in after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was both Wells as well as Russell who traveled together to meet with the leading Bolsheviks, especially Trotsky, who they really wanted to be their guy who would be successful as the sort of top dog of Russia in the 1920s. That didn't work out the way they wanted, but still, they're traveling together. They're definitely, I think they're sort of a Pancho Sanza and Don Quixote type of relationship that they maintain in a weird way. I don't think Russell necessarily respected Wells that much. Wells is from a poor family. Russell is from a higher level of the patrician class, multi-generational. But Wells is very brilliant. He's sardonic. He's got a deep hate of humanity matched with a very deep cleverness and creative sort of power. So he's useful. And yeah, like you said, he plays a role in actual structures like the League of Nations. He runs the League of Nations Society in 1919, January. Lord Balfour, again, who's always working with him, is spearheading a big chunk of this operation in Paris. Their followers, the Wellesians in America, you've got a Fabian grouping set up in America under students of William James, like John Dewey, who creates the new states, the new republic. Walter Lippmann also is a Fabian, a Wellesian, setting up shop in the heart of America to build up this Fabian apparatus inside of the United States. These are the groups that end up creating the Council on Foreign Relations. They oversee the attempt to create a League of Nations which fails because there's still too many nationalists in America who reject it. And Wells, his work goes into the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that's adopted as sort of an appendix to the UN Charter in 1947, but he already drafted that in 1940. As you pointed out, the followers of Blavatsky, like Alice Bailey, Annie Besant, play a role in these institutions as well. Bailey herself creates the Lucifer Publishing that becomes the Lucius Publishing that still to this day bankrolls a lot of the publications for the UN. They have a whole meditation room that's very theosophical in its essence, which is again a fake perennial religion, taking the most superficial aspects of mysticism of every religion and creating a smorgasbord, which is built into the New York UN headquarters. I think there's certain legitimate parts of the UN that had a different origin story, but that got very contaminated after Roosevelt died by these forces, unfortunately.
We're talking about this group of people that they and others have been building this world government infrastructure, which has eventually arrived as the United Nations. But what has that got to do with UFOs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, part of the thesis of you could unite the world around hope or fear, and the oligarchy found that it's much more useful to do some combination of unite people around fear or false hope. So hope that actually carries no reasonable justification for it. Hence Obama type hope, right? Hope in a world that will never happen. Because the people who are being induced to hope this way are fools. So the idea that Wells outlines in a lot of his stories, the world set free, involve the threat of human self-extinction because we are just so, there's these images of human nature just being so selfish, corrupt, foolish as our natural state of being baked into all of his stories. World Set Free features the first nuclear bomb, which wipes out humanity. The War of the Worlds has a slightly different twist, but again, we're essentially useless in the face of the higher technology and the higher intelligence of these warlord aliens from Mars who want to wipe us out. We end up defeating them purely by accident through a germ that kills them, not human ingenuity. In a lot of Wells's stories, the only resolution to the man-made problems, which is never empire, it's never oligarchism, it's always some combination of extraterrestrial threats or humans being corrupt, selfish, stupid things that can only use technology badly. So we destroy ourselves, and the solution is a world government. And it's just it's everywhere. It's in so many of his works. And that's on the one hand the predictive programming that then wires a lot of the science fiction novels, the movies especially the 1940s, 50s, 60s, all the way to the present day. So much of this is wired by the template for how to do storytelling based on what Wells innovates. He's not alone, but he's a big one. So a big chunk of this after the Manhattan Project, which is, I think, part of the Manhattan Project, is it never ended. It was retooled. A part of it was incorporated into Project Paperclip and certain other things that involve taking Nazis or finding all of the innovative scientific and technological works that the Nazis were pioneering, especially in the domain of drones, automated drones that were using certain Tesla technologies, flying machines as well. There was a flying saucer aviation project that was very covert that the Nazis were running. Victor Schauberger was on that team, as were the Horton brothers. There's a variety of models, but they were never put to work. It seems to be in my research that a lot of them were absorbed by U.S. Air Force, U.S. military-industrial complex, the British military-industrial complex, and people began seeing certain things flying, starting especially in the late 46, 47 especially. People were noticing Air Force pilots were looking out their window and seeing what appears to be unidentified objects flying around, little drones, little circular things flying around. Civilians were seeing these things at night looking out their windows. So what were they seeing? On the one hand, there had to be some narrative created to tell the people what they were looking at, because to say we were using rebranded, repurposed Nazi technology that we're testing out is not acceptable, especially under the age of the Cold War. On the other hand, too, it involved, as is so many things with oligarchical operations, there wasn't simply a one-to-one mechanical cause-effect relationship behind, like, why are we going to tell them that there are these stories of aliens interfacing with humanity? Part of it was, I think, also to bring about an initiation process where people would become inclined towards believing that these aliens have been around for a long time. And so part of the idea was always, as we see it now increasingly, it helps to know about things like Project Bluebeam and other things like that, but just general illusionist tricks that are being used by those who control the media, those who control our perceptions of what is reality through mainstream media and through other things. They can create the idea that these aliens are from other dimensions and they have a technology that allows them to interface into our dimension, or they have new technologies that allows them to go from other planets to ours. Either way, there's many of these narratives that we're seeing portray them as a threatening thing, the Greys. They want to destroy us, just like the aliens in Wells's novel. We have David Grush, who's alluding to this sort of thing too, who's an intelligence spook who has been trotted out to be a movement, who's alluding to the various species of aliens in congressional testimonies, right? That's making it seem very real for civilians who don't know how to think about intelligence. They're like, wow, there's multiple species of aliens, and the Russians and the Chinese are working with the more evil aliens, where we are at least having our interfacing with the better aliens, which accounts for why $20 trillion of the Pentagon budget can't be accounted for. Oh, that's why. It's nothing more than we have a secret science breakaway civilization program, says Catherine Austin Fitts and many others, that involves interfacing with UFOs. And so we have this unaccounted for money, which everyone can understand. I mean, why they had to do this, because it's for the greater good to have this, black budget for communicating with aliens. And some of them are really bad. Some of them are less bad. The ones working with the U.S. military are the less bad ones. We have this with, it's just everywhere, right? And so the idea that's sort of floating about is increasingly that we will be made safe from these creatures, these forces, if we band together under some form of Independence Day world government scenario. I'm referring to the 1997 movie,
Yeah.
where we just either and we get a world control, a world government to protect ourselves. We stop fighting each other, and we just deal with this alien threat. Maybe they'll give us a peace treaty and leave us alone or something. But they're out there. And so maybe that's what's always been out there. Maybe that's what Jesus was. Maybe that's what Muhammad was. Maybe that's how I have to rethink about all of my conventional religions and traditions, is from the standpoint that what we thought were prophets and saints and people who did so much good were actually aliens this whole time, and there's all sorts of variations of the theme that we see promoted by the Joe Rogan channel, and Robert Malone is promoting this too. And there's a variety of different flavors to ultimately what is the same thing.
The idea of Project Bluebeam, if I remember correctly, is advanced technology is going to be used to present some kind of massive event which appears to be alien in nature, and this is going to drive us all together. Humanity is facing an existential threat from outside the Earth, and therefore we've all got to come together behind some kind of new world power organization. But there's a religious aspect to this as well, and you've alluded to that with the suggestion that some of our previous religious leaders were, the suggestion that they were aliens, in fact. How does this fit with the whole sort of climate crisis motivation that seems to be taking us into a world religion based on Gaia cult? And how do these two narratives fit together? Are they the two sides of the same coin that are just trying to capture people from different points of view, or how does this work?
No, that's a great question. I wish we had more time. I mean, but yeah, in the most succinct way I can answer that, yeah, I agree with you. I think that this is two sides of the same singular operation. And when you look at how to say this in a quick way, so a big part of the ancient mystery cults that managed the geopolitical world of ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Babylon before that, ancient Persia, Anatolia, it was a world managed by mystery cults. That's the key thing. So the center of command and control of intelligence, banking, geopolitical machinations were the people would have to go, generals, kings would go to pay a lot of money to get intel from the oracles, the Sibyls of Rome, or the Oracle of Delphi, which were usually doped up young women, typically, not always, who were kept stoned on opiates and other forms of hallucinogenic, funguses, plant blights, wheat blights, things like that are the derivative of LSD today. It comes from like a general rot of a bacteria or a fungus that grows on wheat. All that to say, that was used as part of the sacred elixirs of the ancient world. And so these girls would sputter out random mutterings. Sometimes there were techniques of going through a ceremony of cutting out blood, guts from a bird or from maybe a human victim too. I think is probably the case more often than not for the big forecasts. And what the generals, the kings were being told was what messages the gods had for them, answering their questions. These were essentially channelers, right? Like 19th century channelers were a variation of what was going on already back then. And then they would be told, okay, based on the money you gave, to go to war with this neighboring thing, to make a peace alliance, so whole geopolitical strategies were built around people going to these doped up girls, and their words were interpreted by a priesthood of initiated high priests who would interpret the mutterings of these poor girls, or whatever the blood guts were doing, right? And so that's the way the world ran. And the population there was sort of a set of rituals. Everyone was expected to be at least inducted, even the slaves of this ancient world of Egypt, of Isis, the Isis Osiris cults, the cult of Demeter, which had certain bacchanalian Dionysian orgies, which are just sort of two sides of the same thing. The masses were expected to be initiated on a low level. There's a diffused form of first degree initiation for sort of everybody, based on the the maximization of sensual pleasures as an organizing principle of your identity. So during the night, you would have promote orgies, popular orgies. You would promote do what thou wilt sort of stuff, that the Hellfire Club and then probably later on revived. And then in the daytime, you'd have the Apollonian sort of principle of behavior of do your duty, slave, pick the cotton. And then at night, get drunk, get wasted, just have your animal lusts satisfied. And this type of like vacillation between extremes was what was expected for everybody. Now, amongst within the mystery cults, there were always degrees of initiation for those who would have slightly more influence or responsibilities to manage the system of empire. That would go through usually about 7 or 8 gates. The ancient cult of Gaia, the Magna Mater cults, was a big part of this to sort of worship the purity of nature over humans. So it had a misanthropic bent. So part of the idea was human beings are just so corrupt, so our nature is so sinful, vice-ridden, that we're not really good. We're evil. And so there's this idea that humanity is evil, and that nature, because it is more pure, more non-changing, more, you don't put a dog in jail for killing a cat. It's something to worship. And so you had things like the cult of Cybele, which was one of these cults. It was they did a lot of castration of their priests, who would be brought into the upper, slightly higher initiation, not at the highest, and it interfaced always with things like the cult of Mithra, a more men-only warrior cult. And these two cults of Mithra and Cybele were often closely aligned, no matter where they went, whether they were in their Phrygian form or whether they were in their Roman form. But there were two aspects of the human condition that would be used together to manage society. Christianity made these things more difficult because the Judeo-Christian movements denied paganism. They denied the pantheon. They basically denied the mysteries, and they said, look, the mysteries are for everybody. They're not really mysteries. They're not supposed to be secret. We're all made in the image of a living, loving God. There's obviously different rituals that people would dispute about, but that principle of one God, one creator, was very disruptive to the system of controls of the mystery cults. And so they had to, in some cases they rebranded themselves. In the form of the Gnostic Christian sects, the Manichaeans, the Marcions. There's a variety of these Gnostic Christian gospels that were promoted, that basically were repackaged forms of rituals that we had only seen in the Isis cult earlier, that removed the special place of human beings as something divine within nature. So the oligarchy always wants to reduce us to another thing within nature, that there's nothing qualitatively different from a rat, a cockroach, and a human baby. It's all the same thing. It's all just flesh with passions. So that's part of what a lot of the Gnostic Gospels were promoting. When that didn't work, largely because of the combats of people like St. Augustine and the other Platonists in the 5th century, a lot of them basically went deeper underground, but continued in the form of things like the Benedictines, the Benedictine order, which got control of the various, many of the Mithraeum are still today found in Britain, all across Europe. There's hundreds of these Mithraeum, right? These underground temples where the Mithraic rituals would be held. And a lot of them are found under churches today. A lot of them are Benedictine churches. The Isle of Capri is a massive control center of this zone, with a lot of these underground caverns, catacombs, where these rituals were held by Tiberius earlier. And this was given over to the Benedictines when that order was created in the 6th century. We saw a splinter group of the Benedictines create the Templars under, the Cistercian order. So Bernard de Clairvaux was the sort of the Bertrand Russell grand strategist of his own day, or the H.G. Wells of the 11th century, who established the charter for the Templars that would be effectively a rebranded Mithraic order masquerading as Christian to oversee the Crusades. That was part of that spiel. But then there was transmogrifications of this thing into the Franciscans, the Dominicans, that played a sort of conjoined role. Both were created by two guys who collaborated with each other in the 1215 period. One ran the more like masculine Inquisition, crush the infidel aspect of the church. That's the Dominicans. The other one's the Franciscans, under the order of St. Francis, were more, give your gospel to squirrels and trees that are as equal of receiving the gospels and teachings of God as humans are, because we're all equal. So it's sort of like a renewal of the Gaia principle in a Christian sort of veneer. There were a lot of good Franciscans and a lot of good Dominicans. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying everyone's in the inner sanctum, but I'm just saying these are some of the garbs that were created around which the Jesuits were later on formed as an outgrowth of the Franciscans. And the same year that the Anglican Church was created in 1534. So I in my research, it looks like there's a direct connection between that's not a coincidence, and Venice plays a role in both creations. So you have this attempt. This is what ends up. We see this express itself, this Gnostic occultism in the form of the new Rosicrucians and Kabbalists under Francesco Zorzi, who's advising the papacy as well as Henry VIII in the 1520s, the leading Kabbalist of the day, in terms of how do you, what do you create a new religion? Do you get a divorce? What do you do? So these are leading Kabbalists, and this is what creates the Rosicrucian order inside of Britain itself. So all that to say, there's this whole thing that ties directly into what Huxley was doing, what H.G. Wells was doing, and acting upon as part of the occult underground that shapes Anglo-American grand strategy. This is what the British Bureau for Psychical Research was expressing in its own time after the 1880s, and it still is today. And this is what became at the heart of things like Tavistock, MK Ultra, the parapsychology operations out of Fort Bragg, are all directly tied to this occult underground. And many of Aleister Crowley's own followers, his disciples like L. Ron Hubbard, who was a disciple of Crowley, play a role in this story too, as the founder of Scientology, which is plays a major role in both predictive programming and UFO cults, as well as MK Ultra and things like the Stanford Research Institute and the remote viewing operations of Stargate. It's run by a bunch of high-level Scientologists who are effectively, Crowleyites. And Jacques Vallée, I would say this, back to the original point, Jacques Vallée is a major player within this UFO disclosure movement. He's a co-founder of the modern internet, as they call it, as he was working for DARPANET. He was also a student of Jalen Hynek, who was I think he was CIA, but he was always a controller, a manager of this Psyop after 1947 with Blue Book that he advised on. He was himself a fan of Manly P. Hall and Theosophist literature, according to his student Vallée. He ran something called the Invisible College, which was sort of a rebranded Invisible College of the Rosicrucian Order back in the 18th century. So he sort of rebranded that. That was his inspiration. And he created a whole network of figures who would be devoted to undermining, undoing Christianity, replacing it with a new set of sacred beliefs. Vallée's was the person who first innovated the idea of interdimensional aliens in his Road to Magonia in 1969, which was the first to posit that all of the folklore, the fairies, the pixies of Ireland, the imps, the elves, these different folklore of the different parts of the world, including the older sacred stories of Christ and other religions, were actually describing aliens that would abduct us. The elves that would abduct the children from the village in the 13th century were actually aliens that only certain people could interface with because they would do certain drugs. And this is according to, people like, Vallée has been promoting this. Hal Puthoff has been promoting this, that certain narcotics, LSD, other things that were experimented upon by Tavistock and MK Ultra give us access to the other dimensions. They say that alien beings could speak to us or give us technology, which the ancient mystery cults of Rome and Egypt were accessing through their sacred elixirs of opiates and stuff. So this was, I think, put more into motion in the 60s after JFK was murdered. Was they doubled down on this, and there was a whole network of this occult underground in Russia too that was built up even before the Bolshevik Revolution. It was what was overseeing the murder of Tsar Alexander II that remained behind as stay-behinds after the Bolsheviks reorganized things. A big chunk of this Russian occultism tied to some of these older families remained behind and interfaced with these Western groups. Growing things like cybernetics into Russia as a governing mechanism. After Stalin died, this is what was brought in by Khrushchev into Russia as the governing mechanism of control for the Russian Soviet state. It was also being done at the same time by Rand in America over JFK's dead body. Game theory was a subsection of this, right, as far as a way of thinking about the world as one system of controls managed by a priesthood.
So I mean, this is
climate change. Oh yeah, so climate change. Yeah, it comes into this. It's such a big topic, though. It's almost like a whole separate thing. But yeah, it definitely plays a big role in this.
Yeah. Okay. Look, we're more or less out of time, so I want to do two things. First thing I want to do is I want to put a name to you, who's a British name and is all over the British media when it comes to this topic, and that's Nick Pope.
Nick Pope.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you about him first of all. What do you know about him?
I don't know. I haven't done a proper deep dive. I mean, I've just done a summary bio sketch, which is just alarm bells. As for you, I'm sure, this is obviously somebody tied to British intelligence. I didn't. What do you know about him? Actually, maybe you could educate me a little bit on Pope.
No, other than what you've just said, I don't really know very much. I mean, nobody really does, as far as I can see.
Anybody who in this day and age, with the media being what it is, as a giant empire of lies, anybody who's that much of a media darling, who's being fed to us on that regular of a basis, so intentionally, there's something shady going on. One has to presume that he's part of what he was openly a part of as far as British intelligence. He's I don't see any reason why he stopped doing that. And I would look very, based on what we were just saying, in the course of the last 55 minutes, people should think, I think, a bit more critically about the type of messaging that he's putting out there and who it benefits. And, is there a more human explanation for a lot of the phenomenon that people like him, like Elizondo or Hal Puthoff, there's a variety of these figures, David Grush, these are selected public spokesmen. Tom DeLonge is another one, who are public figures selected to promote a common narrative for disclosure. Is there a more human explanation that doesn't involve going to the supernatural to explain a lot of the empirical data that they're talking about? I would say yes, if you approach our history from this more critical standpoint. And the other thing would be, look at the role of people like Lawrence Rockefeller. Like Lawrence Rockefeller founded the Disclosure Project. Does Lawrence Rockefeller, who oversaw the H.G. Wells War of the Worlds Psyop broadcast in 1938 to see how people would respond to information of an alien attack being portrayed as news, does he have a vested interest in the truth, what he and his class represents, or has he been consistently working to enslave humanity and would prefer that we think about aliens rather than thinking like John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. or something more potent? But he founded the Disclosure Project. He was the guy who hired Stephen Greer, one of the biggest, loudest spokesmen for this disclosure thing. Greer was an employee. He was on the Lawrence Rockefeller ranch. He was employed by him. That was what was brought into the Clinton White House. This is what Podesta and Hillary Clinton were recruited to by Lawrence Rockefeller. This is what's bankrolling, is what was behind the creation of the DeLonge operation with Hal Puthoff. This is what's behind Harry Reid, all of the Pentagon disclosure operations in Congress. It's all it's an illusionist trick. It's the same things that they were doing back in the 1900s to get us to believe that these mediums were channeling paranormal activity and exoplasm and stuff from the other domains so people could speak with the dead or whatever. It's not that different. It's actually the same thing with better CGI today and blue beam has advanced quite a bit since Edward Lansdale's efforts to to overthrow Castro with his elimination through illumination operation, right? Back in the early 60s. Right? that's Blue Beam. That's the early proto Blue Beam. It's gotten further in advanced in tech.
You produced 2 documentaries so far. I think they're about an hour each. How many are you intending to have in the series, and how do people watch them?
At first, it was going to be 4, then 8. Now, I'm thinking if we could do about 8 to 10, I think that's probably would do justice to the story, but it's very comprehensive.
And how do people watch them?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, go to CanadianPatriot.org or RisingTideFoundation.net for both of those documentary series. The other thing is my Substack, MatthewEhret.substack.com is a great way to get access to a lot of these things early on, as they'll be released every 2 months or so. Yeah, that's good.
Yes, Matt, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating discussion. The documentaries that I've seen are brilliant, and I absolutely heartily recommend them to everybody. So good luck with it, and we'll keep everybody posted whenever you release a new one. Thank you for joining me.